series where we're looking at a kind of audit of the electoral process towards the 2023 poll. And the simple question we're asking is whether the conditions for free, fair, and peaceful elections is possible this time around. Are we likely to break the cycle of history repeating itself as it has since 2000 elections? Is there anything that would make these elections any different? Now, the topic itself, asking as it does, whether violence has been increasing ahead of the election, it sounds very rhetorical, given the observations some of us have been making, and taking into account even comments on social media. I have in particular two tweets which I thought I should bring to attention. The first is from Sipho Malunga, and it reads as follows: "It will not be and cannot be a free and fair election if opposition candidates are unjustly detained and violently brutalized. Opposition campaign rallies are banned. The voters' roll is not publicly accessible. Voter registration is suppressed, and ZEC is not independent. It's a farce," end of quote. Then today, another tweet from, among many, from Nigel Chanakira. "My fundamental question remains, quote, why are we bothering having this election? Who are we trying to fool?" End of quote. So there appears to be a paradox. On one hand, you have the empirical evidence before us of the violence. I would say that in comparison to 2008, where the violence was most intense towards the runoff after the election itself, here already we see very unusual, intense violence across the country. And as the panelists will be speaking more elaborately on this, the paradox is this: that while we have this apparent violent campaign ahead of the election, we have, on the other hand, a persistent, if not confident, expressions from the CCC, in particular from Nelson Chamisa himself, insisting that the elections would take place, notwithstanding the immense and intense frustration that the opposition movement is facing. Not only that, there is also the confidence, oozing confidence, that he will win the election. It is this paradox that we want to unpack. And we have here Tony Rila as our moderator today. Tony Rila doesn't need an introduction. He's part of this architecture, the policy dialogue. He's my partner in crime, so to speak. Most importantly for this session, Tony is one of the most well-researched in the field of organized violence ever since 2000. He's a repository of detailed reports, accounts of almost every election since 2000. But this time around is the moderator. Then we have Justina Mkoko as our keynote speaker. Again, Justina does not need any introduction. Sadly, she epitomizes the worst face of violence political violence in this country, having been herself abducted and tortured for weeks. An experience which has left her almost permanently marked in that regard. But we're grateful that she's here and is part of us in reminding us of the ugly face of the violence from which Zimbabwe needs to be exorcised before we can say we are a normal country again. Then we have Rashid Mahia from Crisis Coalition, an activist of note. Rashid, welcome to the forum. Then last but not least, Rose Hanzi from Lawyers for Human Rights, who has also graced this platform in recent weeks as part of this process that I've referred to of auditing the electoral process in Zimbabwe. So, Tony, I hand over to you with those comments.
Thanks very much, Ivo. And I'd like to endorse your remarks about Derek Maracek, who worked with the Omani Trust and with Rao, who was a lawyer activist, I think it's fair to say, and was a prolific writer on a wide range of fields, including human rights. And Rao sends our condolences to his wife and to his brothers, wherever they may be. So good evening and thank you. The rationale for this evening is that some of you will remember that we held a similar discussion last November. And we have felt that today, given many of the things that have happened in the audit that we're doing of these elections, we should look at it again. Now, those of you who've been watching the series will know that we have framed this around 5 pillars. These pillars were suggested to us by Dr. Zamchir. The 5 pillars are very simply information, how accessible is all the information available to citizens? Do they understand what's going on? Can they get information from their candidates, etc., etc.? Inclusion, which is really all about the fact that people can actually participate. They can get registered as voters. And insulation, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Integrity, which speaks very much to the whole election process and strongly to the conduct of ZEC. And we have discussed in detail delimitation and a series of issues like that, the voters' role included. And we've talked about irreversibility, which is the issue to do with how do we deal with election petitions. Now, what struck us in thinking about this particular webinar was that every single one of the previous 5 or 6 webinars we've had, every single discussant, and some of them were externals, internationals, but particularly the locals, always returned to this issue of their fears about violence, thinking about the many elections we've had since 2000, in which there has been extremely serious violence. In 2000, 2002, obviously 2008, and to some extent 2018. But every election has been marred by violence. Now, this pillar of insulation that was posed originally by Dr. Zamchir had really 2 components. The ability to freely register. And what that means is, were there impediments and pressures and intimidation, even violence, that prevented people from engaging in the electoral process? The second point is about the ability to vote. That's obviously the critical thing in an election. And I think here you have to unpack it a little, because when we talk about political violence, we tend to too often focus in on the physical violence, the brutality, but there's a wider range of behaviors, violations that go along under this rubric. So in addition to violence, you've got to talk about intimidation. And this is not a trivial topic to talk about in Zimbabwe, because the link between intimidation and violence, I think we clearly understand in Zimbabwe, that if you've had very, very violent elections, frequently people are fearful about elections. And I might add here that the empirical evidence shows that in the SADC region, not only is Zimbabwe in the area of political violence the most violent country in the region, it is also the most violent country when it comes to elections. But you've got to talk about a range of other things that happen under this heading of political violence. You've got to talk about arbitrary arrest and detention. And there are examples of that I'm sure our eminent speakers will talk about. You have to talk about restricted access to meetings and rallies, not only because they don't happen, but because people are fearful to go to rallies or to meetings. You also have to talk about much more subtle forms, what in the political science literature they talk about as clientelism, or in electoral terms, treating. And that's the use of food and resources to compel people to participate in elections. And, and I'm sure some of our speakers are going to talk about the ways in which such treating or clientelism operates in a discriminatory way, putting a compulsion on people to participate in support of one party or another. And then, of course, the most critical thing in talking about political violence is the extent to which the state is involved. Now, political violence, of course, can happen in many elections, in clashes between political parties. After all, elections are contests for political power, and frequently those contests can be highly competitive, and competitive to the point that political parties are violent towards each other. But it also is the case to which, and this has been demonstrated in Zimbabwe by multiple reporting by Zimbabwean NGOs, the extent to which the state comes in and the government comes in support of one political party or another. So that's a whole range of factors that you have to include in the understanding of what political violence is in an election. Now, as Ivo said, we have an extremely eminent panel. They're a panel who was here before in November 2000. I'm not sure Rashid was, but certainly Rose and Justina were. And I suppose the particular question we're raising is from November to now, 5 or 6 months on, as the temperature rises ahead of these elections, to what extent are things improving or worsening? And to some extent about whether there's an opinion on them as to whether it will worse even more towards the elections when the final hustings begin to happen 3 months ahead of the election. So we will take each of the speakers in turn, starting with Justina, followed by Rashid, and then to Rose. I want to point out that Rose is having extreme difficulties with connectivity, as I'm sure many people trying to join the webinar are, either for power or other reasons. And then I will open a discussion between these three experts around a number of questions. And following that, we'll throw it open for a plenary for other people to participate in. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to our keynote speaker, Justina Mukoko, who I think is eminently suitable to start the discussion this evening. Justina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that introduction. Let me immediately say that I might not keep my video on because I'm also trying to manage the bandwidth. And in terms of the issues that you have already put across and what Doc has also put across, I think there was a question hanging there to say, will the cycle be broken? And I don't even need to think about this one. The cycle of violence is not going to be broken in this election that we are getting into. We are just a little off 5 months if the elections are going to happen July, August. And what we are recognizing is that there is a rise in incidences of political violence. And the year actually started with us seeing a video that went viral of elderly supporters of the CCC who were being ruthlessly flogged, and their crime being attending a meeting that they were having under a tree at someone's homestead. And this has not, and that happened in Murewa North in Bunu village. And that has not subsided because we have also seen members of the opposition in Budiriro who were attending a meeting at a private residence who were arrested, and their lawyer trying to stand in and represent them was brutalized by the police. He had to undergo surgery. We have seen a statement coming from the police, but we also believe that lawyers, respectable members of our society, who do not have any reason to be lying about what would have happened to them. And then we are also told of a bus that was ferrying people to a registration center. This bus was waylaid. There were about 80 people on the bus going to a registration center so that they would be able to participate in the upcoming elections. There were 2 CCC supporters who were targeted. They were abducted and brutalized and then released. This is a common thread in terms of what is happening around us at the moment. And I think just over the weekend in Gokwe, there was also violence that happened there. We are informed that CCC was in another village, and his supporters, expecting him to pass through this particular area, had put up a tent. And then they were approached by people from ZANU-PF who said they wanted to play soccer at the place where they had put up the tent. Obviously, tempers fled and violence erupted. And these are issues that continue to erupt in different parts of the country. I have just highlighted a few cases that demonstrate the physical violence that citizens are having to deal with. But I think our biggest challenge that we are facing at the moment is the fact that there is a lot of intimidation in communities. We have done a visit to a number of places. In Mashonaland Central, we went to Shamva, Bindura, Glendale, and Concession. In Manicaland, we went to Headlands, Makoni South, Buera South, Chimanimani West. And in Mashonaland East, we went to Mutoko North, in South, Murewa North, Marondera Central. What we are recognizing is that citizens are under a lot of pressure in terms of what is required of them. Meetings are being convened by traditional leaders. And I believe that this is an outcome of the nationwide mobilization, OPF, Kembo Mohadi, who went throughout the country, where he was encouraging traditional leaders to campaign for ZANU-PF. And the people that we were able to talk to were basically telling us that it has become impossible for supporters of the opposition to have meetings. The meetings that are happening, at times they are actually called as development meetings. And when people get to where the meetings are happening, they actually then recognize that it is a ZANU-PF meeting. And it is in these meetings that people are actually being threatened, threatened with 2023 being more serious than 2008. So when you go out into a lot of these communities, you recognize that people are actually very fearful. And in Mount Darwin West, villagers in Ward 36 report that they are also being forced to put on ZANU-PF regalia by the village head, who says that, and I quote, "I am trying to keep you safe." I am not sure keeping them safe from what, when he's actually violating people's rights by forcing them to put on a regalia of ZANU-PF. You know, and then when you ask these citizens to say, but if these are only threats, why are you so afraid? A lot of them respond to say, ZANU-PF does not give empty threats. And what they are being told is that there are a whole lot of myths that they are being told, that are being used in terms of how they will be able to follow up on who they have voted for. And people are actually very fearful. And one other thing that is also being used in these communities is also to distribute agricultural inputs. And there is no uniform standard in terms of what people are supposed to be getting. In Mashonaland Central, in Bindura, the majority of people were only getting 2 kgs of a seed that is actually very strange. It's a very small seed. You'd think that it is popcorn. And then when we went to Glendale, we discovered that people there were actually getting much more, to the extent of getting 5 kgs of maize seed and 5 kgs of beans, and also fertilizer. And then you also ask yourself, where are the other things going? But what we also recognized is that those who are targeted are then discriminated when these distributions are happening. I think what is also said is that while we are getting a lot of rainfall in some parts of the country, there are parts of the country that are actually going to require food aid. And when you have people requiring food aid ahead of an election, it also means that they are also going to be subjected to a lot of violence for them to be able to access food that they will really require for them to guarantee food security for their families. Citizens are also being required to be part of the ZANU-PF cell structures. I think we are all aware of last year when it was announced that there was going to be a cell day. That is a tool that is also being used to track those that they suspect belong to the opposition. So a lot of people in a lot of communities are basically just putting forward their names in these cell structures in a bid to protect themselves. because they are afraid things might just go the other way if they do not do that. In one area, once one person actually said that the quietness that is in the community, in their community, is actually suspicious and is an indicator of terrible things to come, because they are really feeling, they are living in fear when all they have to do on a daily basis is go to these ZANU-PF meetings. And we have also picked up that women are the most affected. They make up the majority of those who go to these meetings. The reason being they are the majority in rural areas. And this has also been confirmed by the census. And I think the other aspect that is also coming in is the aspect of artisanal mining, where communities are talking about a lot of violence happening in mining areas. And a lot of the violence that is taking place there actually is going unreported. Police are said to be afraid to go into those areas to go and investigate. And we feel that this is a group that is actually likely to be used to perpetrate a lot of violence, and also to be used to whip people into line to vote for ZANU-PF, instilling fear in people, because when people see dead bodies, they are likely also to feel fearful. And with the looming delimitation of constituencies, there is a likelihood of primary elections in the political parties being more vicious. There are already still subtle conflicts as aspiring candidates await the final delimitation report, but you can actually feel that there is a lot of jostling. And actually, this is where we get the most vicious of violence, when people within the different political parties fight to represent their political parties. So the issue of the delimitation report does not make it any easier in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. We also understand that a lot of communities where vending happens, they are also being forced to ensure that they vote for ZANU-PF, otherwise they will lose the vending sites that they have got. And that is an issue of great concern. And I think the issue of political parties other than ZANU-PF not being allowed to have meetings at the local level does not bode well for an election that people want to make credible. I think we are already starting from a very from a situation that is actually I would say poisoned, because if political parties are not able to access their supporters, it means that we have got a situation where the environment is not level, and it will only give us an election that will not deliver what is expected. And maybe for this, I would also recall what Dr. Mandaza was saying, Nigel Chanakira said, to say, who are we fooling going through with an election that we already know is defective? Because from the moment you get into where one contestant has more access to meeting their supporters, I think we have a huge problem that we need to deal with. And I think before I end, I would want to then say, I think I want to put forward some recommendations and say all political players need to be given a chance to access communities and for communities to exercise their fundamental freedoms and also be able to freely go out and elect their leaders. Because what is happening in communities, this bringing together of people around traditional leaders who are also supposed to shepherd these people to polling stations does not bode well for an election that we might talk about being credible, because there would not be any credibility when people are being force marched to go and vote collectively. And I also think that there needs to be timeous investigations by the police and the prosecution of election political violence perpetrators. And the nation needs to be given regular updates on cases that are outstanding. I will list some of the cases. We know Mboneni Ncube lost his life. Up to today, we don't know what happened to the people who killed Mboneni. And as long as perpetrators are allowed to go scot-free, they will repeat that. We are also aware that a number of people, when the violence that resulted in the murder of Mboneni, there are others who were injured and left with life-threatening injuries. But still the perpetrators are at large. We also know the callous murder of Mo Blessing Ali. We know someone was brought before the courts, but up to today, we don't know what has happened in that case. We also have the violence that broke out in Matobo and in Caesar. And I think there was information that was very clear in terms of the vehicles that were used, because the people who were affected actually registered the car registration numbers. But up to today, we were promised that investigations were going on, but up to today, we do not know what has happened to the perpetrators of that violence. And now we have Murewa North and Gokwe as well. The police will issue statements, we are investigating, and usually that's the last that we hear of it. So I think we need to have investigations going on. And then we think that political leaders also need to lead the process of social cohesion, tolerance in communities, and coexistence among their supporters, and also be able to limit the hate language that they use, because hate language actually breeds a lot of violence. I would also want to say enforce the provisions of the Electoral Act in terms of dealing with perpetrators of electoral violence, and start rolling out the multi-party liaison committees so that they become a way of life in communities, so that people, if they have complaints in terms of the violence that they are being subjected to at times, it's important that we have multi-party liaison committees actually addressing the challenges that communities are facing. And the last one is the National Elections Command within the police needs to be initiated. I think when it came in 2018, we worked with the National Elections Command, some of us, and it helped deal with some of the issues where women were specifically affected by violence at elections. So these are some of the tools that I think need to actually be instituted so that we are able to address the issues of violence that is facing our communities. Tony, I will end there.
Thank you very much, Justina. I think it's so interesting that Firstly, you ticked the boxes in all the areas that I raised early of concerns from previous elections and added many more to that. A question to you, because ZPP, as everybody knows, looks at violence in this broad frame that you're looking at, and you've given us many, many cases. And of course, you put out monthly reports, and those monthly reports quantitatively look at the trends. How do you think ZPP is seeing it quantitatively? Are you seeing a rise overall from November to now?
Definitely, we are seeing a rise from November. I would actually say we saw a rise from the time that the by-elections were proclaimed in March. And those numbers have not gone down over the months. And we are definitely seeing a significant rise in terms of the numbers.
So what you're saying essentially is that this trend that we've seen in multiple elections since 2000, this rise in violence ahead of the elections, quite a long time ahead of the elections, just is a steady increase towards the polling day.
True. And I think in this instance, some of the citizens that we were able to talk to were actually saying, why do election observers come into the country late? Because people were now saying, maybe if election observers came in a little early, it will actually be easier for people to be able to exercise their fundamental rights that are related to election, and also be able to reduce the incidences of violence that people are being subjected to.
Thank you, Justina. I think also your presentation pointed out the utility of the 5-pillar framework, because I think the way that you spoke, you begin to link issues like delimitation to inclusion, you know, can you register, what's going on? It shows us that the election is a holistic event. And what I'm deducing from that is the centrality in all of this violence. So thank you, Justina. I'd like to turn now to Rashid Mahir. He is currently with the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, but he also leads the NGO, the Heal Zimbabwe Trust, and Heal Zimbabwe Trust is very much on the ground in the communities. And so it's really the same question to you, Rashid. You know, since November, 5 months ago, are things getting better or getting worse? Rashid, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, colleagues. My apologies, my videos isn't coming out. Can you hear me?
No. We can hear you very well. You're welcome to keep your video off. We understand the problems.
Okay, thank you. I'm Rashid Maria with Heal Zimbabwe Trust. We work in communities, particularly communities that were most affected by the violence of 2008. We seek to bring communities together to prevent the violence from taking place, to build a sense of community so that we insulate communities insulate themselves from violence that is imported into them by politicians or any other outsider. We think it is important for communities to build relationships, to restore the relationships that they had prior to election violence that has taken place. What we have seen, and we also document violations that take place as a way of preventing violence from taking place in the communities. But what we've learned and seen in the communities that we work in is that since 2018, since the election of 2018, Zimbabwe has been in election mode. We have not left the election. Our political party players, the government, he has consistently acted as if the election is there tomorrow. And that's why we continue to talk of the polarization that continued to exist in communities post the election from day one. In communities that we work in, there is a sense that there is a calm. Where there's no direct violence, there is a calm before the storm. And the election is the storm. So there is this inherent fear that once the election date has been proclaimed, once the primary elections in political parties start, the level of polarization, the level of fear is so high that there is fear that the communities might explode. And that is an inherent fear that we need to deal with as Zimbabweans nationally and in the communities that we work in. And why is this calm? How is this calm characterized? It is one issue that have been raised by my sister Justina there, that there is already structural violence in those specific communities that we work in. This violence is seen by the selective access to resources on the basis of political or party affiliation. You will access a mine, you will access food aid in some areas, you will access inputs on the basis that you align yourself with the ruling party. And related to that is the fact that power in the rural communities at the local community level resides in informal, non-state structures, particularly structures of the ruling party. So you see at a village level, there is an office called the chairperson. And that chairperson at the ward level is the chairperson of the ruling party, but he has influence to the extent that he will determine or greatly influence who accesses what aid and who doesn't. But it's not a formal structure of local government or any other structure, but because it's a structure of the ruling party. And people in the communities have continuously raised this, and this remains an issue. So if you don't belong to the party, there are chances of not accessing the aid is extremely high. Secondly, this quietness, this calm before the storm is also a result, and this fear emanates from unresolved cases of past human rights violations. So, Tony, you gave us the order of violations that have taken place from 1980 to the present, and the election-related violence from 1980, 85, 90, up to the present, up to 2018. And in the majority of those cases, the perpetrators of that violence have not been accounted for by the law. Not only that, they remain influential in the communities that they live in. They occupy the very same influential positions within the ruling party and probably some within government that they occupied at the time of the perpetration of the violence in the past. Some of them are within the arms of the state, particularly the security arms of the state, and they remain in those spaces. They're untouchables, you know, and they can easily remind you of what capacity they have to cause harm to you at the community level. And communities have experienced, as Justina said, the threats are not empty. And because of that, there's always this fear. So up until we deal as a nation with these cases of unresolved past human rights violations, we will continue to have disputed elections, we will continue to have fear being the major factor affecting participation of our people in any democratic or governance processes that take place at the community level. Because of that, there is the level of polarization is very clear. You said that you are ZANU-PF or you are CCC, and other smaller parties, of course, but there's a clear dichotomy in these communities. And for us to, and that is clear from one election to another, it doesn't just happen towards elections. It's a way of life. And until we deal with that, we still will still experience this fear and this polarization. So even if there's no direct violence that takes place, there's this fear, this expectation that things are going to blow up. And this is further reinforced, particularly in rural communities, by the role that traditional leaders are playing. And traditionally, of course, and constitutional, according to the Constitution, they have an important role to bring communities together, regardless of the political, social, whatever affiliation. They bring the social, they keep the social fabric of the community, the beliefs, the values intact, and reinforce them. But because of the role that they have been given by those in government, the party in government, they are then forced to be partisan. And when they are forced to be partisan, then they leave other members of the community vulnerable, largely because they have been excluded because they belong to the opposition and are regarded as outsiders in that community. And you know, now as we speak, Chief Fortune Jarambira, who's the president of the Chiefs Council, still is a pending case, where he was very clear about his partisan, how partisan he is, and there's a court order that obviously has been ignored, and nothing has happened, which brings us to the issue of impunity, that there is no equality before the law. And these are issues that are taking place at the community level, right? Where people see that there are some people in the community that are not touchable, that obviously can do as they please, can violate, and obviously they are abused as we go into the elections by those that are in control of the state. And there's a problem. So traditional leaders are being abused in those specific, not necessarily because they really want to, but because, of course, there's a challenge of going against the state and going against those that control this monopoly of violence. You know what it does, and we know what has happened in the past. And these are some of the issues that have to be dealt with. And so we are also seeing a growing population of young people being exposed, particularly in the urban areas. A growing population of young people who are idle, no access to employment, they have no access to anything else, and all over the communities, and they are now exposed to drugs. There's a high prevalence of drugs in drug abuse particularly in the high density suburbs. And in my view, and in our view as in Zimbabwe, that creates a very dangerous source of violence in this calm before the storm in areas where there's no direct violence, because you have young people that are energetic, but that can be abused by political party players when the elections are really kickstart. And we've seen that happening. We also look at how there is a closing of the space, monitoring of communities. There's monitoring of communities. Access to communities is denied. I was in Zaka just last week. You know, the challenge is that if you speak to people within political players across the divide, the opposition political players will tell you that they are not even allowed to hold a single meeting. Even when they make that application, inform the police, for some reason, there's already, that venue is already booked by the ruling party. For some reason, 3, 4, 5 occasions still, in different venues, they've already been booked. So there is that denial, they're being denied access to their constituencies and access to also hold these meetings. And another factor that we see, a new trend, is that the violence is no longer, is that the state is using disinformation and propaganda to evade accountability over its acts of violence. So you get to a point where there's been violence that has taken place, particularly we are suspicious that the state is involved. But then what happens? People are abducted and the state turns around and says, no, this is a false abduction. People are, and then those people that have been victims are arrested again and subjected to long pre-trial detention. And this has gone on for some time, and we can speak to many cases. In the cases, the state has also gone to even further weaken the cases of violence perpetrated on the opposition. You can look at the Murewa case that Justina spoke about, where an old man is arrested. And yet that video was very clear that these were young, energetic people. But an old man is arrested, and you hear nothing of that case from the police. And then the police issues a statement claiming to investigate cases of violence reported by both ZANU-PF and the CCC. So you find that the victims of violence are also now being investigated, but there's no person who is from the ruling party who's arrested. Let's go to Nyatsime. When the violence took place in Nyatsime, it was obviously violence by the two political parties. But now, as you speak, it's only Job Scala who's in prison pre-trial, and the people that were arrested were only from the opposition. What kind of violence that's come from one, and yet we know the clashes that took place. So as we have these conversations, the state needs to come clean and needs to create an environment where citizens have confidence in the state institutions that are responsible for their protection. Citizens need to have confidence in the police, citizens need to have confidence in the security arms of the state. They also need to have confidence in the Chapter 12 commissions that are supposed to protect the citizens' rights. So, as we have these conversations, we also need to appreciate that, and we underline that, the violence, and we expect it to increase, especially when the election date has been announced and the campaigning season has been officially announced. That's when you have political violence, open violence taking place. And this is evidence in the past. You've seen the by-elections and how the violence is taking place. And the nature of the violence, again, in the by-elections, you realize that it's people that are imported from other communities. Look at the violence in Matobo. People are imported from other communities to come and carry out acts of violence in communities that they don't live in. Largely because communities have learned, and over time, the effects of violence against each other, especially when it just happens towards elections, and they are left to themselves by the politicians only to be summoned, only to be mobilized again towards an election. They've learned and understood that they do not need to commit these acts of violence against each other. And there are many lessons in the communities that we work in, where communities have gone to each other's families and tried to find ways of having peaceful coexistence, practicing the traditional practices that they're supposed to do, going through the church to try and find ways of working together. We've got young men that are traumatized that you see in communities, that you see in communities. So we've seen that. So what are the recommendations that we propose? Firstly, because we have we need to create confidence in the state institutions, particularly the security sector. The complaints, the law that was passed and signed by the president to try and to implement section 210 of the constitution needs to be, the president needs to appoint the commission, so that communities, the citizens are able to report violations by the security, of course, security sector people. Other issues that have been raised by Justina, of course, enforce the Traditional Leaders Act to ensure that neutrality of chiefs. Section 160B of the Electoral Act should be to make sure that the multi-party liaison committee is permanent and strengthen its power to deal with political violence. There's need also to amend Section 190 of the Act to broaden the submission of administrative complaints beyond voter registration, so that it covers issues around political violence. So from our end, as Zio Zimbabwe, we continue to encourage the communities to come together, to shun political violence, and realize that elections only come after 5 years, and that for communities to develop, they need to continuously hold duty bearers, politicians to account, and they can only do that if they come together and realize that and ensure that politicians are held to account. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Rashid. Thanks very much. And an amazing endorsement of the perspectives put forward by Justina. I'm sure many people sitting here who have watched Zimbabwean elections over the years are having a very strong sense of deja vu. Everything both of you are talking about is a repetition of a pattern that we've seen before. And I want to pick up on and raise a couple of questions and put them to you and Justina for you to respond to briefly. The first one is that both of you made reference to 2008. Now, one of the key issues in 2008 that was unraveled afterwards was that there seemed to be a very high degree of organization behind the violence. And one of the key factors always in this violence is the role of militia. Justina made reference to worrying about the artisanal miners. You've made reference to strangers in communities. So it's a very simple question. To what extent do you see organization, and to what extent do you think a militia are part of this organization? Perhaps I can go first to you, Justina.
Thank you, Tony. It's clear that there is some organization and some instruction that is coming from some central place. Because like I've indicated, that going from one province to the other, you listen as if you are still in that same province that you have been to, because what people are describing in the other province is identical to what you have had in the other province. And I have no doubt that these are instructions that have actually been sent to all provinces in the country. So organization is there. But what is also clear is that there are people in these communities, I wanted to identify them as gatekeepers, who really want to know, who are you? Why are you going to visit so-and-so? Why are you looking for this number in our community? What exactly do you do? So I have every reason to believe that, I'm not sure if I can call them militia, but they are people who are in these communities whose role is to gather information and pass it on to someone. And I think this is where we then find action being taken against people who might be doing something. I'm also thinking that that's what exactly happened with the flogging of the elderly in Murewa North, that a message must have gone out through these people who are gathering intelligence and communicating with someone. So I think it's a strategy that has been set out in terms of being able to get this information.
Thanks, Justina. Rashid, what do you think?
Thank you, Tony. I think what we could have left out in terms of the nature of the violence here is the role that the youth service, the resumption of the youth service in some communities means, because there are communities that we can speak to that are in other spaces where there is a resumption of the training of the youth service in those spaces. So what then it means, it speaks to the intention of the state and the ruling party to have a formal structure that enforces and ensures that the violence is carried out. And also, secondly, is the mobilization of the war veterans, the war veterans coming in the ruling party as a structure of the ruling party, a formal structure of the ruling party. And obviously, I think they were demobilized in 1980 for very important reasons. And now you have them coming as a formal structure of the ruling party. There's no war going on. So you would want to understand why you need them, obviously, for the purposes of enforcing the violence and the fear in the communities. So it's very clear, the strategy is very clear to have some central place that coordinates, but also that it also properly coordinated at the local community level. And for us, I think that's important.
Rashid, just carry on with that. I mean, as you will probably recall very well, one of the things that was present in the run-up to 2008 was the presence of the army in communities. Do you see any presence of the army? You're talking about informal groups, but do you see much presence of the army in communities?
In the communities that we work in, there is no physical discernible presence of the army, but obviously the army is as visible, is as present. The military, the security is as visible as they are invisible in communities. But in this particular time, in areas we work in, we've not heard of the physical presence of the military in those specific areas.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that's interesting. The second question to both of you, and Justina, you raised that, and you raised the issue of the differential effects of this political violence in all the forms that you're talking about, through the intimidation, distribution on women. Maybe you could say a little bit about how women are affected differentially from men in this.
Thank you, Tony. I think what we have seen in the past, which is also quickly creeping in the environment at the moment, is that we tension because it's someone's wife. The rivalry might be between two men, but in order to get back to each other, it is the woman's body that then becomes the battlefield for these two. So we have seen in the past where men have fled violence from their homesteads, and we have seen women actually being punished for that. We have seen women being raped. We have seen women being assaulted. But what we have started to see in this period that Rashid has said has continuously been election mode is also the deliberate abuse of women. We saw in Matobo and in Caesar how women were physically abused. They were assaulted. And I think when we saw the group of the elderly in Murewa North, we also saw how women were also being targeted. This woman who was interrogating those elderly people, I remember her saying, "Imimi mother, imimi, chicha munowana ku triple C," meaning, what do you get from triple C? And I think they found a softer spot in terms of targeting the women in all that. And I'm sure that this is also going to rise. And like I said, that it is the women who are the majority in rural areas who are being summoned to these regular meetings where at times they are subjected to a lot of abuse by the traditional leaders if you so fail to attend a meeting. In one area, I was actually told that the messenger of the traditional leader moved around with a piece of paper where when they told the people that there was a meeting, they also requested them to sign on this piece of paper. And this woman I was talking to was saying that she had refused to sign on the paper, but the next day she did go to the meeting and was questioned about why she refused to sign. And she said she didn't know why she needed to sign after she had been told there was a meeting and she was planning to go to that meeting. And I think we also recognize that when we look at victims of violence, At times, we want to consider women as secondary victims, but I think they are both direct and also secondary, because when their husbands, their sons, their brothers are victims of violence, it is the responsibility of nursing those actually falls on their shoulders. But what we are also recognizing is that the violence that is targeting women is also contributing to young women not wanting to be involved in politics. Initially, I spoke about the delimitation process. I think there is actually going to be a lot of violence in relation to how the constituencies are going to be divided. I think women are actually going to be elbowed out in a lot of the constituencies, and they will continue to be subjected to abuse even in parliament, where they are told that they have come on the back of Bakosi, meaning that they do not have constituencies, and someone just feels sorry for them.
Thanks, Justina. Now, a question to both of you, because it's a concern for many people that I've been speaking to. We may be a day away from the gazetting and implementation of the Private Voluntary Organizations Act. And it's an act with a very broad ambit. To what extent do you think that the PVO Act is going to handicap the kind of work that ZPP and Heal Zimbabwe and other organizations do on documentation, on assistance to victims? Is it going to have a negative effect? Maybe I'll start with you, Rashid. Perhaps you can give me some comments on that.
Thanks, Tony. Obviously, the PVO bill, the law, if it becomes law, will affect all civil society organizations, especially those that are in the human rights work, in many ways. But most importantly, broadly, it is just the mental overload that it puts on civil society activists. That comes with the fear of being closed and shut. It has also led to self-censorship. So you speak to civil society organization leaders, there is the reluctance to come to platforms like this. We have these conversations for the purposes of self-preservation. People are not sure of what is going to happen. And this then affects our ability as broader civil society to provide oversight on the state. It also affects the capacity and interest and will to document the violations. It also limits access to communities, because now, even as we speak in communities that we work in, it's as if the law is a de facto law, right? It's not been passed, but it's already being implemented by some local government in the areas that we work in, the rural communities. So the law is already operational in some areas. So it obviously affects access. But also, it's not just the PVO law. There's also the Criminal Codification Act, and obviously the patriotic bill component of it that is put in there, and what it means about engagement, about advocacy work that we civil society has to do. So we have already been labeled as civil society as traitors. We have already been labeled as civil society as prisoners. And already, if you operate in that environment, it becomes difficult to build trust in the communities that we work in. So obviously, it has a great impact. And that's why we obviously encourage the president not to sign this law, because we think this law is undemocratic. It goes against the Constitution, and it even goes against the ideals of the liberation struggle that they really fought for. So we need to have this, to be clear on this, that closing the space is exactly what they went to war for, unless of course they've forgotten, maybe because they've gotten a bit older. But of course, that's from our end. Thank you.
Thanks. Justina, I mean, ZPP has, I don't know, 15 years of monitoring violence and all sorts of human rights violations. Is the PVO Act going to interfere with your work? Are you going to be able to do the work?
Obviously, it will have an impact, Tony. I think like what Rashid is saying, I hope that the president sees sense in not appending his signature to this piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that we see as one that will make it difficult for communities to exercise their fundamental rights. And I think the huge challenge that we see is that communities are going to be vulnerable and isolated. I think they've benefited a lot in past elections where they are able to access information that is related to the election and also accessing voter education. We all know that voter education is also done by CSOs. And if this law comes in, it might actually limit the number of CSOs that will be able to go out and do voter education. And the greatest concern for me are the myths that are being spread in communities where people are being told about how people in ZANU-PF will tell where they would have voted. And I think this is a huge problem that ZEC needs to approach and ensure that they demystify a lot of these information that is being spread in communities. And I think, Tony, my other worry is the fact that there are processes that are happening in Matabeleland in terms of Gukurahundi. And for me, it doesn't make sense that we are solving a problem in one part of the country, but actually then continuing to have the same that happened that is now being dealt with by the chiefs in Matabeleland, having people also being subjected to violence. So this vicious cycle seems to be going on, and it depends on who is being targeted. But there is no doubt that the PVO Act, the PVO bill, if it becomes law, will actually affect organizations and also the generality of citizens.
Thanks, Justina. Now, before we go to the floor, I want to put a question to both of you and just deal with it very shortly if we can. It's in two parts. Is it worth going to elections? And if not, what are we going to do? Justina, is it worth going to elections? And if not, what do we do?
Tony, I think you know my thoughts. For me, it doesn't make sense to go to an election when things are not in their proper place, where things are defective, because we will just end up with a disputed election. I think looking at what needs to happen in terms of having the election, we are not set to go through to an election, let alone just the violence that is affecting citizens.
And what do we do? It seems inevitable, and you both are very pessimistic about how this is going to come out. What are we going to do? Any ideas?
I think you can turn to Rashid.
Okay, all right. Rashid, is it worth going to elections? And if not, what do we do?
Yes, Tony, I think under the current circumstances and conditions, elections are fast they will not achieve the objective that elections should, to allow citizens to participate freely in choosing leaders of their choice. But unfortunately, for now, as we speak, it seems like the ball is in the hands of the political parties. And if both major political parties agree that they want to go to election, I can assure you that we'll go to elections. But what we would prefer as civil society, as citizens, is a situation where there is a national dialogue, where there's a consensus and agreement on a roadmap to a free and fair election. An election that clearly allows citizens to choose leaders of their choice. And I think that, in my view, in our view, we'll go to elections and still have the same problems post the election. If the election is 29 July, on 1 August, we still have the same problem. Probably, we pray we don't have a repetition of 1 August in 2018. So the ends are still a fuss until there is a clear clarity in terms of conditions created that allow people to choose leaders of their choice freely without fear, and that will work for us.
Thanks, Rashid. So, to all of you in the room, I think you've all been listening, and many of you, I can see, have been listening to the 6 or so that we've been having before, and almost all of them tend to conclude the same way, that there's pessimism that this election can come out anywhere close to being free and fair by the standards of best practice at any rate, and maybe somewhat lower than that. And this evening, I think we've unpacked again the notion of the fears about violence. So I'd like to put it to the House there. Is it worth going to elections? And if not, what do we do? Rashid's made the point that it seems an inevitability, and Ibo raised that right at the beginning, that we're going pell-mell towards this election. So we'd be interested in your comments. If the elections are not going to meet the best practice standards and it's not worth going to elections, what do we do? It's a two-part question. You can answer either. If you have a question or an answer, please go to the chat there and raise your hand, and I'll go to you. Okay, anybody got any thoughts on this matter? We always seem to get to the point where I think we've diagnosed the symptoms, we've identified the disease, but very often we don't come up with any treatment. I think it's very important where we're going to. So, any comments from the floor? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to take chairman's moderator's privilege. And,
Tony, I'd like to Tony.
Okay, all right, but hang on a second, Ibo. We've firstly got Madreen. Madreen, please come in, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ibo, and thank you, Justine, and also thank you very much, Rashid, for the insightful and practical information that you have given us. We have a feel of what is happening on the ground. Most of it, we are seeing it in the media. And my concern, like what you have also said, is the increased selective application of the law, selective distribution of food aid, so to speak, detention without trial. Now we are seeing violence against elderly women and elderly people and women, so to speak. And even failure to observe the constitutional provisions that are clearly articulated and enshrined in our own constitution. And I can see we have regional people who are logged in here. When such things continue to take place, is there any higher appeal platform where such issues can be addressed? Because what I hear you, Tony, asking is the way forward. What do? We have got these challenges. Is there no, like, an appeal court of law where such issues can be taken and also mitigation strategies taken. It's up to everybody who is listening on this platform.
Thank you, Madrine. Miles Anderson. Unmute yourself, please.
What does a general strike do? What would Gene Sharp do in his book From a Dictatorship to a Democracy? As a whole, as a community, can Zimbabwe get together and decide that the way forward is through peaceful resistance? And I'm just tossing balls onto the court. How does a general strike sit with the people of Zimbabwe? I know that people are starving. I know that people have to work, but I think in order to achieve some sort of freedom, people have to suffer. Such is the way of history. Such is the way of the Black civil rights movement here in America. And suffering has to continue, and only through suffering can freedom at last be attained. That was promulgated in the late 19th century by Black peace movers and freedom lovers. So I know that people in Zimbabwe are suffering, but perhaps they have to suffer on a far greater level. And that sounds very easy for me to say, sitting in my comfort in America, but I don't see any other way in that we are going to shake off the shackles. And to hear people say, well, you know, the president would be silly not to sign it, I would think it's 95% certain that he will sign the bill. So there we are. That was my question.
Thank you, Miles. Okay, 2 questions there. Dr. Shomba, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I think we are predominantly discussing issues that have pertained election after election. And ZANU-PF is not giving the space that is required. And I would like to put a precursor for the others here in the room to know that I'm a former member of ZANU-PF, former Politburo member, former member of parliament, and I have others here who were in ZANU-PF who were my seniors long before I joined ZANU-PF. So there's some knowledge that we get by having been on the other side of the fence. And there are reasons why we are no longer in the other side of the fence, either because we disagreed in the manner of conduct, we disagreed in the system, and there are a number of things. Now, it's so difficult in Zimbabwe not to know that ZANU-PF closes the space, not only during elections, but throughout, using the legislature and the judiciary. And these are some of the things that we challenged in the 2018 electoral challenge that we participated in. But again, the playing field is always convoluted, and civic society has participated in that convolution. In that, when we start defining participation of elections, we need to understand and define who the contestants are. We need to know who the opposition is and who the incumbent is. When we talk about opposition, it's not every political party or every contestant that is genuinely contesting elections. Others are proxies of ZANU-PF. And I say so knowledgeably because I know that a number of proxies were asked to participate and participated in aid of ZANU-PF so that ZANU-PF can get leverage in whatever constituency that they wished to have leverage using the extra structures of perceived non-ZANU-PF members. Now, crucial to understand the issue of violence is to understand the systems that are deployed by ZANU-PF. During elections and just prior to the election process, there is active intelligence work that takes place in identifying potential opponents in order to disable them, to threaten them, to weaken them, and to ensure that they do not even have the resources to participate. If we tend to just look at the violence in terms of the physical beatings, killings, and so forth, we will be focusing on a major segment of it, but omitting the other work of violence that takes place by ZANU-PF, by the police, by the intelligence, and the military. We may not physically identify these people because they don't do it in their regalia, in their uniforms. They get embedded in the systems and structures of ZANU-PF. More particularly the military, they work with the commissariat department to identify and discipline those that are of other views. Now, most of the military that participate in this are either members of the military, and we need to scrutinize that because the recruitment process in the military usually follows through children of war veterans who are already naturally indoctrinated. And I'm a former senior officer of the military, so I know what I'm saying. And so their loyalty is naturally to ZANU-PF, not to the military in terms of the provisions of the Defense Act. We therefore find that they're either children of war veterans or they are war veterans, and then come into ZANU-PF structures and work with colleagues or former colleagues or parents in the structure of the war veterans. And they use that to obviously run their terror in the communities. And as a consequence, we have a subdued society in Zimbabwe. That must be acknowledged. And this is not only in rural areas, it's happening in urban cities. I was a member of parliament in Mashingo Urban, and these things were being perpetuated. I did not receive a single ZANU-PF aid or support during my time. And had I not had resources of my own, I would have lost that election. But I had to pour in resources, and it's about resources. Right now, every opposition member cannot have access to funds. We have to use smart structuring. My party is using smart structuring. I've asked them to maintain radio silence until sometime in April in order to have an element of surprise when we go on the ground. But civic society, when you say to them opposition, they look at one single party and say that's the opposition. So what does the state do? Okay, this civic society are adding this to do or cause regime change, let's fight them. I think we ought to be smarter in the way when we are dealing with an incumbent, a revolutionary historical party, a party that is known for its violence. It conducts elections and wins them. So it wins an election, then conducts the election. And once we know those things, and we know we cannot undo the role of the police, the intelligence, and the military in the few months left to elections, should we have elections. And so we need the understanding of what is the short gap measure? What do we do in order to change, because it's difficult to listen to the contributions I've been listening to and to assume that we can go and advocate for this and cause this to happen, or some tribunal or some discussion, and maybe the government will not do this, maybe the president will not sign. Please, let's live in the time, in the reality that we are dealing with a system that is corrupt, a system that's determined to rule by force. And whether we discuss niceties here, procedures and laws, let's have options that we can cause to happen now. And how do we empower? What gaps are there? And who are the genuine participants? And also stop singularly thinking that this mode is more effective than the other. Let's be fair to allow key people that are able to contribute to play and come onto the scene. The violence is a tool that is deliberately designed to intimidate and disenfranchise voters, right up to the voting, through to the counting, through to the announcements. Abductions take place. And to try and speak nicely about this as if it's something that we can mitigate in this election, I think we are being too nice and playing into the hands of ZANU-PF. This is my initial contribution for now.
Right. Thank you very much, Daniel. I think you made the point pretty comprehensively in response to my question about organization. I think you've rolled out the, if you want, the shadow process of being organized. And I think that was documented pretty comprehensively for 2008. And I think it was evident in many human rights reports for 2002. There was a question from Madreen, appeal to a higher court. As we understand it, you cannot go to another court unless you have exhausted all options within the local jurisdiction. So in other words, we can't complain until the election's done and the Constitutional Court has ruled against any kind of petition. But we have to remember here that the one avenue that we used to have, which was the SADC Tribunal, following extensive lobbying by the ZANU-PF government, that was disbanded. And as the Constitutional Court ruled in South Africa, that the South African government unconstitutionally withdrew that. So there was a potential court, but there are avenues that you can go to, but there are consequences on the election result itself. While we're discussing this and waiting for anybody else who needs to make any kind of comment on this thing, I think you've raised, another question was raised, how would we respond? That was raised by Miles Anderson. I think that, again, I think this is one of the problems and why we raised this particular question about what do we do? And that's the reason for these seminars being held by Rao and SAP is that if the situation ahead of time is quite clearly indicating that these elections will not pass muster, they will not achieve any kind of acceptance by the standards by which elections are run, then do we wait for the elections and the result? And when we do, what do we do at that particular time? Or do we have pressure ahead of time that, in fact, the elections are unacceptable? That's the question in front of you, folks. Any comments from people on the ground there? Okay, very quiet for such a hot topic. So maybe at this particular point, I'll go to Ibo and maybe ask him if he's got some comments. Daniel, do you want to come back to that? Can you keep it brief, please, Daniel?
Yes, thank you. Justina raised a pertinent issue in terms of election observation. What we need to do now is cause partner organizations that are able to and are going to, and legitimate observers to commit and to have the necessary tools to be on the ground early and to cause the systems of both foreign affairs and the electoral body to have these people on the ground earlier. And they should not come in their small numbers as they always do and rely on the state resources to be deployed. They now need to invest and clearly in a major way. And the reason for this is clear. Lives are being lost. People are being maimed. Everybody's lost their democratic rights, and the economy is collapsed. And we all pretend that we are functioning. We are not. And so there must be the acknowledgement by SADC, AU, and other parties, international organizations, and civic organizations themselves to register as observers and to seek resources early enough to be on the ground as early, in my opinion, as much, and invest in province by province, constituency by constituency. And whenever an evildoer realizes that is being watched, it becomes difficult for evil to be perpetuated. But what is important is not just to observe, is to ensure that those reports, the outcomes of these processes, are written continuously and continue to build on, not just to wait until after the fact and then say we need so many weeks to start writing the report, and by which time we are trying to engage alternative remedies. It will be too late because the horses have already bolted. We need intervention that is continuous and progressive. So that's the one way. But the other way is to ensure that they be direct engagement of the police and the military to adhere to their role in terms of the Constitution. And also
Daniel, the others wanted to come in. Can you wind up, please?
It's okay. I'm done.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, Hazel Cameron, you'd like to come in?
Hi, Tony. Firstly, thank you so much for a really fascinating discussion. I feel really privileged to be part of that. So thanks to all the discussants and to Justina for her keynote speech. What I want to ask is that we've spoken about like the elderly CCCC members being targeted, women being targeted. I'm interested in whether there's evidence of civilians with no particular political affiliations being targeted at this point in time. How do we foresee that they may be treated as the elections approach? Also, there's been rumours about the NYS, the National Youth Service, was reinstated in 2021, formerly known in Mugabe's era as the Green Bombers. What's the evidence on the ground that these terror bases have been set up in some provinces and the youth militia are targeting local communities?
Right, I'd like to go back to our two keynote speakers. And there's a range of issues here for you to address. But in general, feel free to make your remarks. But an important point was made right at the end there by Dr. Shumba, about observers. And I'm just going to throw out a devil's advocate comment, and that is that in the discussions we had on delimitation, Anzi Klakula, very, very experienced election observer and head of the South African electoral body, made the comment that she said international observers are largely useless because they cannot observe with the kind of forensic lens that is necessary to understand. And I want to link that to Dr. Shumba's point that the system that's set up is so pervasive and so deep that it may well be unlikely that international observers are unable to do that. Okay, before I go, Phil Zamchia, you got your hand up? Phil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ton. Hope you can hear me because I'm traveling, but
Yeah.
so keen on the topic as usual. To organize very, very important meetings. Can you hear me? If you can confirm.
We can hear you. You're a bit shaky, but go ahead.
Oh yeah, so yeah, thanks for organizing the event. And I would like to say that, you know, what happened in 2017 was an unconstitutional and violent overthrow of a government, no matter how unhappy we were with that autocratic government at that juncture. So I think that violence, you know, as Justina was saying, and Rashid, is likely going to increase as long as we as Zimbabweans, the region, the international community, and Democrats across the globe do not sit down and say, how do we address and cure the military coup that happened? And I think that this juncture, that military coup is shaking not just Democrats, but also it's shaking the ruling party from within. I just published a paper on intra-party cohesion within ZANU. Even some elements within ZANU-PF, they want that violent overthrow of the government that's you know, managed to be cured. They want it to be cured. And a lot of Zimbabweans want it to be cured. I actually think there's need for leadership to say, at a certain level, not just local, maybe mobilize everybody at an international conference level to say, how do we cure the military coup that happened in 2017? If we fail to do that before our ink dries, there will be a recurrent military coup again, and violence is gonna worsen. But thank you for organizing. Thanks for the presenters, always relevant, always fantastic.
Thank you, Phil. Well, there's another thing put on the table, curing the coup, in addition to extremely organized violence. And I want to use that word because we've been talking about political violence. I think the context in which everybody's been talking about, and Dr. Shumba endorsed really what Rashid and Justina said, this is not political violence per se, it is organized violence and torture. Okay, to our speakers. Justina, some last thoughts from you, last comments from you. You've got a free hand to reflect on what you've been hearing.
Thank you, Tony. I think some of the interventions are quite interesting. And like you've said, I think what Dr. Shumba has spoken about just confirms the issues that we have brought to the fore. And I think just now there was a question in terms of terror bases. I think this is a question that we have been asking communities where we visited. I think these have not been set up as yet. If they are going to come, probably they will come later, but I was not, we were not shown where there are terror bases. Maybe it's too early for them to be on the ground, but for now, we have not heard of any terror bases. And then I think there was also a question of just common citizens who are not members of any political party. I think what is happening in communities is that at times people who are targeted are simply perceived to belong to the opposition. Perceived because at times people also want to settle scores with people that they have not been getting along with, and they will point fingers at people who probably are not a member of an opposition party. And we have seen this to be very rampant, even when it comes to children accessing BEAM. We have children who have failed to access BEAM because their parents are suspected to belong to an opposition party. And then in terms of the issue around election observers, I think even for us, we have recognized that as soon as election observers land, cases of political violence actually take a nosedive. So maybe if we have a few teams that are in the country well ahead of time, I think this would really help. Tony, I think I have addressed what I needed to address, but I think what is important to recognize is that unless bold steps are taken, there is no way that the vicious cycle of election violence is going to be broken. I think it needs more effort for us to be able to break this cycle.
Justina, thank you very, very, very much. And as always, your input is very, very important, and unfortunately, you so often have to give us really bad news. Rashid, over to you. Any last thoughts, comments, observations? Rashid? Maybe he's disappeared. I don't see him anymore. Rashid, are you still here? Okay, no, he seems to have disappeared. Okay, connectivity again. All right. So before I hand over to Ibo, I really want to thank Justina very much. I want to thank Rashid. I'm very sad that Rose Hunzi was not able to join us with connectivity problems. But on reflection, when I said earlier on that we have a terrible sense of deja vu, I think the worry for us in Zimbabwe when elections happen is what kind of a deja vu are we going to have? Is it going to be deja vu of a kind of 2008 or 2002 or 2000? Or is it going to be a more 2013 or 2005? And the violence is less extreme. I think the concerns expressed, that were expressed in November, were of great worries. I think that the predictions that most of the people who spoke on that platform in November, Justina and others, their predictions are holding firm. In fact, that violence is increasing. And I think that's a great, great problem. Addressing it, I think once again, we reach the point in these webinars where the overwhelming scale of the problem around elections and every aspect of it, from what one commentator has talked about as anticipatory rigging, i.e. intimidation, violence, setting up of terror bases, those sorts of things, is complementary to what is called constructive rigging, which is the manipulation, if you want, of the vote and the counting and the court. So we have clearly a very complex problem, but I have not heard any solution. So for me, it's to say thank you to all the speakers, and I'd like to hand over to Ibo for some last remarks before we close. Ibo, over to you.
And thanks, Tony. Before thanking you and your panel, I just want to go back where I began about the paradox. The paradox being that for the last 20 years, every election has been disputed. Every election has been marked by a level of violence. And yet we go into elections again, relentlessly. Why? I think the first is that we can understand why ZANU-PF once elections, and I'll come to that, the 2013 incident where SADC tried to have the elections postponed. ZANU-PF has now learned the need for elections as a legitimating process of a rule in which, or a dispensation in which there has been no free, fair, and peaceful elections. And almost in keeping with the northern democracies, where elections are virtually a religious precondition for the so-called democracy, and they tend to feed it. I mean, you heard it a few weeks ago that the EU is putting some 5.8 million US dollars or euros into the elections in Zimbabwe. And I dare say there are many others who are doing the same, not to mention the observer missions, which have ritually come to every election and go back to report almost to the last of them all that elections were not free, fair, no peaceful. So what I can understand is that we seem to relentlessly, as Zimbabweans, go into elections without asking questions, even when, as is being described in this webinar, but also in previous ones, previous six others, it has been very clear that this election is likely to be the most violent. Why? Because it appears to me that the intra-party, as some chair indicated, the intra-party conflict has been so vicious. Secondly, the presidential candidate who lost in 2018 in 2018 118 constituencies, the presidential candidate, ZANU-PF's presidential candidate, lost. An example is Matabele North, where ZANU-PF won 9 seats, and Mnangagwa got 5% of the vote. So it appears that whereas the tendency, therefore, is to try and overturn that pattern and sort of generate confidence that Mnangagwa would win the election this time around. And this, in part, accounts for the violence that, unlike previous elections, is already instituted long in advance of the election. Now, the political economy of elections in Zimbabwe is very interesting, especially in the current economic climate. Politics has become a livelihood. The difference between being unemployed, being a vendor, no shoes, no nothing, as to use a rhetorical term, and being an MP with a vehicle, a salary, is enormous. It accounts for even the intra-party violence at primaries, not to mention the extent to which there's a frenzy towards elections. In part, this explains why the paradox, why the opposition movement in particular is unable to see things as they are. They are party and parcel of the election industry, what another colleague calls the election brigade. Now, thirdly, we need to dispel the question whether it's worthwhile going for elections was not answered firmly enough, in my view, by the panel. Because there is always an impression that elections are inevitable, they're constitutionally provided for, they must take place. I think it's false. It's a false, and I think we need to go back to 2013, this SADC summit, which was called in Maputo in 2013, in June 2013, in an effort to have the elections postponed And I was there at the summit, post-summit meeting held after the summit at the Radisson Blu, where the opposition, Tsvangirai, BT, Wash, and Mube, were called aside in a meeting of the heads of state of SADC, and were advised not to go for elections. The intelligence gathered by the heads of state from the respective embassies and high commissions was very clear that one, the elections were rigged already. It was not worthwhile going for elections. What happened then? ZANU-PF on his part went to the Constitutional Court, and which prescribed that elections must be held. And Morgan Tsvangirai and his party decided to go for elections notwithstanding. And I remember Tsvangirai phoning me 3 days before the elections to tell me that he had enough information indicating that the election was already rigged against him. And I reminded him of the summit. The point is this. I would say that the SADC, and South Africa in particular, can intervene on the basis that the audit of the electoral process is not given to a free, fair, and peaceful election. That this election, 2023, is likely to be a case of history repeating itself. And therefore, as they did in 2013, seek to postpone the elections in favor of a process that inheres the national dialogue, regional and international intervention in the Zimbabwe process, and thereby seeks to convince both the ruling party and the head of state of the need to seek an alternative, which is the pursuit of a political settlement in Zimbabwe, an economic restoration in Zimbabwe before elections. I think that's the way to go forward. And it is possible constitutionally to have elections postponed. But the question is this, and we get this, many of you may have read our article that Tony and I penned a few days ago. And the question we're getting as we move around the region is this, that yes, all the indication that the conditions for a free, fair, and peaceful election are not there in Zimbabwe. But why is it that both the ruling party and the opposition, Triple C, are not only are calling for elections notwithstanding? And I would say the opposition, Triple C, are even louder than the ZANU-PF in the insistence that the elections should take place, and that with some benevolent intervention from above, some spiritual intervention, there is no way that Chamisa can lose the presidential elections. So that is really a brief on the political economy of elections in Zimbabwe. And also in putting it as I have, is to say to us, we must, as Zimbabweans, consider very seriously whether we want history to repeat itself as it has before, and delay the urgent need for a political and economic settlement in Zimbabwe. I'll leave it at that. And thank you again. Thanks, Tony, for conducting a very useful and very constructive dialogue on this subject. Thanks, Justina. Thanks, Rashid. I'm sorry that Rosalind wasn't able to make it. And thanks to all of you who participated in this discussion from far afield as the US, the UK, Australia, and nearby South Africa.
Tango e komaka, kaina komi moto,